Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I'm Chair of APA's New Urbanism Division, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, September 28th, and we will be hearing the presentation, Let's Talk About Privilege. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number that you see there in bold. For your content and questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, again, located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all of our participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we ask that you reach out to them and suggest that they join us. Today's webcast in particular is jointly sponsored by the Kansas chapter of APA and the LGBTQ division of APA. So thanks to them for sponsoring today's webcast. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions, and you'll see a lot of save the dates. Believe it or not, we actually even have more than this, and really save the date because we do have sessions coming. The information is just coming in now, and actually I just got word that I have another one to fill in. So be sure to check back on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, for more up-to-date information in the next few days, because I'll be entering a bunch more of these sessions in. Today's webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM ethics credits. Yay! We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education, and for availability of those, just head over to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And to log those credits today, just head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and then up at the top, you can search by either the title of today's webcast or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on those sessions that I just told you about that are coming down the pipeline. So like us, and you can keep tabs of our upcoming sessions there. And we are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel. You can head over there and just type in Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. We'll also have a PDF of the presentation at the conclusion of today's session, again, on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, I'm done with that. I am going to turn it over to Cade, and Cade, you take it away.
Great, thank you again. You always make it very helpful, or you're always very helpful in setting up the webinar, so we really appreciate that. My name is Cade Hobick. I'm a former chair of the LGBTQ and Planning Division, and I'm pleased that once again our division gets to have a part in helping host a great ethics session. And again, it's with Bonnie Johnson, who's from my alma mater, University of Kansas, and this time also joined by Ward Lyles, also from University of Kansas. So thank you both. And I also want to mention that throughout the development of this webinar, we had the really great input of Jen Roberton from here in New York, also a member of our division. So thank you, Jen. Today we're going to cover a really challenging topic, and this topic, privilege, may seem especially relevant to contemporaneous discussions like maybe some current events happening right now in DC. And I bet that without too much thought, we could agree that the topic itself seems like some pretty challenging subject matter. We'll discover, I think, though, together, we're all in this together, and also with the privacy of our own respective computer screens, that this topic, privilege, proves very challenging in many ways just to discuss. Now, we're planners, and we're concerned with the public interest, and we're also human. So it's wise for us probably to choose to seek some guidance, such as the AICP Code of Ethics. And today may be the first time many of us really think about the topic, much less examine the Code of Ethics for answers. So today, Bonnie and Ward will be leading us through the discussion of privilege with the planning profession and the AICP Code of Ethics in mind. But all the rest of us, along with them, will be participating. And while participating, we may discover some things about ourselves. And I want to close on this note, sort of offering a gentle warning to our listeners that you and I, we may very well confront some uncomfortable ideas and feelings. At times, some of us may find ourselves outside our comfort zone or feeling insecure, questioning our own need to care, questioning our own abilities to address privilege in our work and our lives. We may want to believe that others will take care of this, or that certain ideas will simply evolve or disappear over time. We may find ourselves wondering if we're really even capable of thinking about the topic critically. And we may feel guilty, or embarrassed, or even angry. So I really want to thank Bonnie and Ward for putting themselves right out here in the middle, leading us through this discussion, which really matters. The discussion matters, the continuation of it matters, and all our participation matters. So with that, I thank you, and I'll turn the floor over to Bonnie.
Thank you, Cade. So while our photos are still up on the screen, so this is Bonnie. Ward, I'll have you just say hello.
Hello.
So that was Ward, and you just heard from Cade. So we're going to start off with, this is an AICP ethics session approved for ethics credits, and we have to start with some required content, which this here is Jim Peters, the AICP ethics officer, and he's going to remind us this session has been created to provide general education regarding the AICP Code of Ethics. Though examples, sample problems, and question and answer sessions are an important part of illustrating application of the code's provisions, all certified planners should be aware that only the ethics officer, that's me, Jim Peters, is authorized to give informal advice on the propriety of a planner's proposed conduct. And only the ethics committee can give a formal opinion. If you have a specific question regarding a situation arising in your practice, you are encouraged to seek the opinion of the ethics officer, Jim Peters. And Jim is very responsive. So what are we going to do today? So this is a little roadmap. We're going to start off with a little bit of a quiz here and then see if you can spot which of the items we have on the screen are from the AICP code. We're going to do a brief overview of the code, some motivating questions for talking about privilege, some terminology to help us understand what we're seeing and what we're feeling. We'll do some kind of little activities that we'll talk about, some activities that you can use for self-reflection. We'll talk about the 4 pillars, which are going to give you a critical eye for how to think about what's going on. And we'll end up with how the code performs on some of these issues. So the first thing we're going to do is this is a little bit of audience participation, and you are going to be able to go in on your computer here in a second and log in A, B, C, or D. So when was the last time you looked at the AICP code? A, within the last year. B, last time I got my AICP ethics credits. C, when I studied for the AICP exam. Or D, never. So you should see a little quick poll pop up and you can answer that, and then we'll see what everybody's answers are.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yep, the poll is up, everyone. So go ahead and click away, and I'll give you a few seconds here. Well, everyone's really responsive, Bonnie.
Oh, good. Good. Well,
You're into it
everybody's aware.
today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. We'll see how this goes throughout the presentation. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm going to give it 10 more seconds, everybody. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and then I'll show everyone the results. Share. All right. So results are in. When was the last time you looked at the AICP code? 26% say within the last year. 48% say the last time I got my AICP ethics credits, which happens to be the largest percentage. 22% when I studied for the AICP exam, and 4%, nope, never looked at it. So Bonnie, I'm gonna take it back and return the screen to you.
Okay.
As soon as I can get my computer working here. Okay, you're all set. The screen is back to you.
Okay, great. Well, so we're seeing some evidence that doing these required AICP ethics credits work, in that it is getting you to take a look at the code. So here's our next question, and unfortunately, we can't do the polling feature with this one because the items are so long. So I would have loved to have seen your responses to this, but so just think about these. See if you can spot which one is a line from the AICP Code of Ethics. So the first one we have is A, should obtain education about and seek to understand the nature of social diversity and oppression with respect to race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, immigration status, and mental or physical ability. Okay, is that from the AICP code? Well, here's another option. B, shall in all matters related to their profession treat all persons fairly and encourage equitable participation without regard to gender or gender identity, race, national origin, ethnicity, religion, age, sexual orientation, disability, political affiliation, or family, marital, or economic status. Or is the line from the AICP Code C, shall not unlawfully discriminate against another person? Or is D from the AICP Code, members shall not violate the law in the conduct of their professional practice, including in any federal, state, or local laws, and particularly laws and regulations in the areas of antitrust, employment, environmental and land use planning, and those governing professional practice. So think about those. I wish I could see which ones you would choose, but I will move on, and we will, I will reveal the correct answer. So if you chose C as being from the AICP code, then hurrah, you selected the right one. The other ones, A is from the Code of Ethics for the National Association of Social Workers. B is from the Code of Ethics of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and D is from the American Society of Landscape Architects. And each of these codes really does provide us with something to think about. The social workers code talks about doing the work of understanding the nature of social diversity and oppression, while the engineers, they kind of list everything out. It's pretty comprehensive. And then D, the landscape architects, hey, they're even mentioning land use planning. Who would have thought about that? And then C is the AICP code. And we will return to the AICP code as we go through this. So let's kind of think about why do ethics matter and have a brief overview of the code. So if you want to, go ahead, load up the code, and you can look at it or refer to it as we go through the show here. But really, ethics matters, and we have the AICP code, and there's also the APA Code of Ethics if you're not AICP. And in general, ethics matters and our codes matter because these are expressions of who we are and what's expected of us in our profession. These codes of ethics are meant to elevate our profession and to help us when we get stuck as to what to do. The codes remind us that we are in this together. If one of us is not trustworthy and competent, it influences what people think of planners and our profession. So it's part of our identities and how each of us perform our duties and uplifts the profession reflects on all of us. So I've got another bit of a quiz here for you, and this is one that you can participate in again from your computer. So we'll do the polling again. Which of the code sections is enforceable? That is, if you violate it, you can lose your AICP status. So we have A, Section A, Statement of Aspirational Principles, B, Section B, Rules of Conduct, C, Sections A and B, or D, any of the sections.
Right, that question is posted, so go ahead and select your choice. We'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close it, and then we'll look at the results. Excuse me. Okay, results are in. Section A received 1% of the votes. Section B, 62%. Sections A and B, 6%. And any of the sections, 32%.
Okay.
And that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we're seeing that a good amount do know the correct answer, which is Section B, the rules of conduct. So if you put that, give yourself a pat on the back. That's the correct answer. So now we're going to start transitioning to talking about our specific topic for today. So if we focus in on the code and our topic, the rules in Section B say no unlawful discrimination. On the surface, that sounds pretty all-inclusive until you realize that some states have not made discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression unlawful. In other parts of the code, it does ask us to share the goal of building better, more inclusive communities and to seek social justice. So for me, I didn't really know how to think about taking meaningful action on those issues until I started to understand privilege. I read the book, and in my input into this session will be leaning heavily on a book I recently read, which is called Deconstructing Privilege. It's called Deconstructing Privilege, and it's edited by Kim Case. And in that, she points out that privilege is the flip side of discrimination. While discrimination is unearned disadvantage, privilege is unearned advantage. And it's really, if you are someone who is lucky enough to experience a lot of privilege, you don't even recognize it as such. And so that's part of the work that we're going to be doing today with this session is really understanding how we could take meaningful action to pursue our goals of seeking social justice. And I'm gonna turn things over to Ward to kind of launch us thinking about these things.
Thanks very much, Bonnie. And I want to start by echoing Cade's setup for us. These discussions can be, the thoughts and the discussions can be challenging on an intellectual and a personal level. When we discuss this in the classroom with students, one of the things I try to do is frame that if you think about your kind of your sense of tension. If you are on a scale of 0 to 10, if you are at a 1 or 2, you're probably not really engaging with the material. If you're somewhere between, say, 3 and 6, then you're probably working well. But if you feel yourself moving up to 7, 8, or 9, then that gets into unproductive levels and can even be traumatic. And so that is something as you participate in this webinar, and then also to the extent that you choose to do some of this work yourself, or you're familiar with some of this work already, those can be some guiding principles, because as we grapple with questions like privilege and identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the reason that we need to talk about these things, and presumably the reason that you are here listening today, is at least due in part that as a society, we have not resolved tensions between privilege and discrimination. So identity is a question. If you ask people about their identity, you can get all manner of different responses. And so our first question is, when we think about identities, what does it mean in this context, and when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and privilege? And so the University of British Columbia, the UBC there you see at the top of your screen, has a social identities worksheet. And this is we have the file here linked so you can do this. We don't expect you to do it here in this moment, but this worksheet, there are many variants of this, but the worksheet sets up a set of domains. These are characteristics, and they're characteristics that have impact on us as we move and interact with other people, or they can. They may not always, but they certainly can. And we each have our own identities in these categories. And one of the things that I find really helpful about this worksheet is that it juxtaposes to the extent that we feel privileged or marginalized, and marginalized being similar here in thinking in terms of discrimination. You can even, depending on the situation, think about oppressed as another category. But what I really like about this social identities worksheet is that it recognizes implicitly that there is a context dependence. So if instead of the place I live now, we were to edit this into, say, in my workspace, that's really different than perhaps the place I lived as a child. Or you could think about when I am on the weekends or not working in the environment I'm in, that our identities, they probably do not change. These things tend to be fairly static. But to the degree to which we're privileged or marginalized can change. When we use this worksheet, well, let me back up for 1 second and just say some of these issues, if you're thinking about these in the privacy of your own space, then you can be kind of forthright and open and honest. But some of these identities, if we ask or force other people to identify, they may feel that may be a double marginalization, a double level of discrimination, depending on the situation and the status. And so one of the things that we do when we work with this worksheet, instead of asking people to, so to speak, out themselves, we use questions like these to help us think through how identity plays out. So considering all your social identities listed in the table above, on a daily basis, which ones are you most aware or conscious of? You can pick more than one domain if you want. And so it becomes really interesting of identities that people are most aware or conscious of can vary quite widely in a population. Certainly from my experience, hearing from people of color, that it is hard to move through a day in our society and not be reminded in some way, shape, or form that you are not identified as white. Whereas you can move through many spaces in our society and not think about the fact that you were white. There are situations that are more male-dominated or more female-dominated settings. And so what can be important to do when we reflect on our identities is to reflect on what we appreciate and what we might gain from that identity, and also if there are things that are negative or difficult about that identity. The identity is who we are, but then in the context and in our interactions, that can influence our experiences. And then the second question building from that, which of these identities are you least aware or conscious of? And speaking for myself, it is really easy to forget that I'm able-bodied and that I could walk or bike to work without really having to think about moving around, as compared to when we talk on our campus. We're up on a hill, and if you even just temporarily are in a walking boot, or if you have an experience of being in a wheelchair or otherwise have mobility limitations, navigating our campus can be really quite complicated, extra time consuming, and it's really easy to just get caught in our own daily habits of mind and forget that others have perhaps more complicated experiences navigating. Then it's also good to reflect on what stood out most to you in this exercise. If you do this on your own, I would encourage you to pay attention if there's some of these identities that you might resist recording, or if they're, as Cade mentioned, sometimes, especially when we move into the realm of talking about privilege, that some of these things we didn't necessarily ask for. And so it can be a strange mixture of defensiveness or guilt or wanting to rationalize our feelings. And it also invites the opportunity, if this is done with other people who perhaps have different identities than you, to think, to ask questions and to learn about other people and see how their experiences can be different.
Well, and
anything to add, Bonnie?
yeah, Ward, when I first did this worksheet, it was actually the first time that I really even thought about that I was a first generation college student. I mean, today as an academic, and I'm talking with first generation college students or trying to make sure that they are successful, I didn't even think about myself. And then when I did this worksheet, it dawned on me, oh my gosh, I was a first generation college student. And looking back now, there were things about that experience that did actually negatively impact my education. And it's because I didn't understand the college academic culture. I thought I had to do it alone. I had to pull myself up by my bootstraps, and I didn't need help and didn't want help because I wanted to do it myself. And so when all these professors were wanting to mentor me, I thought, no, I can do it. I don't need to give me this extra help. I can do it. And I look back now and go, good grief, they were trying to be a mentor and I just was not receptive. And it was because I didn't understand that that's what they were doing. And I can look back and see that now.
And for me, I am not a first generation college student. My mother was, and we have discussions about that in our family, and I had some awareness, but then by talking about, for me, with the social identities worksheet, allowing students to do it privately, but then being able to walk through the door of being able to talk about their experiences, it's really interesting the things that surface that you can't necessarily see, and how sometimes that gives, again, advantage or barriers. And it's revealing too to hear students talk about, I came to college and I assumed that in college everything kind of just levels the playing field. And I got here, and then I got here and I realized that it's really quite different. That the level of poverty that I experienced while I left it and live now in a dorm with other students, it was not that part of me stopped when I came to college, and thinking about the privilege marginalization in a place I live now versus where I grew up, was thinking about how people who identify as LGBTQIA in a college town may have a lot more room and domain to be their full selves, but in their small town they came from, realizing that there were people who were closeted and not able to be their full selves. And so it's really interesting how this can open up, this type of exercise can open up self-awareness, but it also can create the bridge for compassion. and thinking about how other people that we often don't see their full beings, and we also don't see their suffering. And I think as planners, that what we see in the classroom transfers as we think about what happens out in our interactions in small groups and with public meetings. And we have a bit of a paradox in the sense that on the one hand, we want to approach every single person we interact with, or we aspire to approach them all as individuals, and a person is a person is a person, we are all human. But if we then say that if we think that we can treat every single person the exact same, and assume that we all came from the same starting point, then we're really we're making a false assumptions and reducing the ability to communicate with each other.
Yeah, so when we sort of forget about these social identities and we're thinking that we're treating everyone the same, then we're not recognizing the reality of how other people are reacting to us and what has influenced us from the outside.
Indeed.
And so are we ready for a working definition of privilege, Ward?
That sounds great.
Okay. And you might explain these images.
So one thing a colleague of ours has done with great effect, Stacy White, is when we're talking about terms, that sometimes it's interesting to see what Google, throw in the term into a Google search and hit image and see what images pop up out there in the world. And if you don't have to think about it, it's a privilege, framing it as this juxtaposition with discrimination or marginalization. There can be many different dimensions of privilege. I would argue that every single person on this call has at least one dimension of privilege because, well, one, you have access to a computer or a phone.
Yeah.
And then so at a very basic level, and then you can work your way up to, if everyone here is AICP, then at some point you probably have higher education. You probably have some funds to allow you to be part of AICP. It's not cost neutral entirely. And so we begin to think about what are the things that allow us to participate in different activities in life. Our colleague, I would call your attention to the image in the middle on the left. This is one that is actually really a very simple exercise that can be done. And that's to have people be in an environment and take a trash can, ask everybody to ball up a little piece of paper and move the trash can around and see how people's reactions are, especially if you say that if you make the shot, then you're going to get $1 or $10 or an A on your next test or whatever the incentive might be. Then that really helps to explain that we all did not start with the same privileges. In this case, it's a very simple piece of your privilege based on where you're sitting relative to a goal.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, and I think we have a written definition here as well. So a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. And so we're going to now ask for some reflection on this topic.
Yeah, I would like. I have a question for you and Kate, and I may chip in as well. And as we reflect, I would ask those of you that are listening to this webcast to also think through in your own experience. When have you seen privilege? When have we seen privilege in our work? And it's important to think about that on many different identity characteristics, there's privilege and marginalization. So there are many different ways this can play out.
Yeah, and Kate, I don't know if you want to jump in here or you want me to go first.
Well, I'll share an initial thought, and that is, a lot of times we could have an easy go-to in terms of like, let's talk about how people advance in their careers or not, but we could skip that entirely and just discuss a lot of what I see people like recent graduates, what Bonnie described really struck me because I see a vast difference between some people who are very comfortable and familiar with the educational system and perhaps professional environments, asking for help, reaching out, interacting. Networking just seems a little less intimidating, or at least maybe they're a little more able to fake it, than other people who I know for a fact don't necessarily have that background, didn't have that advantage of professional parents, for example, didn't know just what you described, going to college, that you can ask for help and that's a good thing. And I see a lot of people sort of count themselves out or not take advantages of opportunities that are there because they think it's not for them or they're not quite sure how to get their foot in the door, so to speak, when really it is something as simple as just express your interest.
Well, and I'm going to kind of bring up that a couple of times I've been at public meetings, and I don't know whether any of you have probably had this happen to you, of being in a public meeting when the topic of race comes up, and it's often uncomfortable. People don't know what to say, and when people do talk, I find that they talk about two things, that they are inadvertently expressing privilege with the two things that they commonly say. The first one is they say, I don't see race, I'm colorblind. And as I've read the book Deconstructing Privilege, I realize that that's something that I have probably said or thought a lot. And then now with kind of taking a step back and learning what really is underneath that, is that this colorblindness is ignoring privilege, and it's ignoring the racial context of social identities and public policy. I mean, if you don't see race, then you really aren't coming to terms with, I mean, let's face it, we're planners. I mean, we know that zoning codes have their basis and their origins in being discriminatory. The tools, the subdivision regulations and zoning that we use every day don't have an inclusive history. They started out as ways of excluding people. And so I think if we don't confront that and don't think about race, we miss the good and the bad. We also miss those times when communities of color have accomplished great things. And then we miss that, oh, I'm actually using a zoning code that maybe I need to check in on. What are the ramifications of it? So being colorblind sounds good, but it may not.
And this, I've seen this play out at a very visceral human level, and that is when there have been organized discussions around race, or race has come up, that often hearing tremendous vulnerability and pain and anger being expressed around experiences of systematic racism and individual bigotry, and that often what you can watch and perhaps even feel in yourself is a sense, oh, I don't want to be identified as part of the problem just based on my race. And so there's a desire to profess colorblindness, and I don't see colorblindness, but one can acknowledge that there's tremendous racism in our society without, and that we benefit from that racism if you are white, without saying, oh, I'm a bigot and I want to treat individuals with discrimination. But to say that I don't see color, or that's not a problem here where we are, we've moved beyond that, actually says that your experience does not matter to whether we're talking about people of color or other people who've experienced marginalization, that it says really that I don't see you, I can't hear you, and I'm choosing not to see you and hear you because I don't have to. I can move through and not really feel or experience these problems. So it's the interplay of the systems and the individual, and it's really complicated, and it's there's thought and there's emotion that's really mixed in here. It's not easy work.
Yeah, and the second thing that I've heard at public meetings, when those rare times when we actually talk about these issues, someone will say, oh, well, my kids don't discriminate and they're great. They all get along. So let's just wait until our children get older and then everything's going to be okay. And I've heard that, and I kind of feel like in my stomach that that's somehow not quite getting it, but it is a little hard for me to articulate what maybe that is getting at. I don't know if Ward has a way of explaining why I feel uncomfortable when I hear things like that.
I mean, I think to some degree that is seeding. It's more comfortable to withdraw and not experience the feelings or thoughts that can come with difficult work.
You're sort of saying I don't have to be involved. I just have to wait for others, or I don't have to do the work.
I think that it may be that you can feel that way. There also could be, I mean, and there's some wisdom in that from a self-protection.
Mm-hmm.
There can be some wisdom in, I mean, some of the discussions that happen can put us in fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? Because there's a lot of pain that is occurring in our societies. And one of the beauties, I think, of planning is that part of our work is calling us to help humans flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something really motivating and empowering in that. But it also is a risk-taking venture. I know that that's you've talked to a planner, and that's a quote, that engaging the public is a risk-taking venture. And we don't take risks without sometimes missing the mark. And also when we think about that generational impact, there's a danger there because we're being observed every time we do anything. Whether it's the adults, I mean, that has also been something in the news right now. Cade referred to is, okay, what messages are teenagers who are watching discussions in the U.S. Senate right now getting about how we interact with each other? And so to bide our time and wait for a momentum, that's an easy way to let inertia not allow for progress.
Well, and it is kind of ignoring that discrimination is embedded in our systems, and whether we sometimes realize it or not, within public policy, within the very institutions that we're operating in, and that in the past, when it was more overt, you have whole groups of people that just because of who they are, they have been disadvantaged, and they don't have the same ability to have that their families in the past generations accumulated wealth and were able to hand that down, weren't able to hand down to their kids this knowledge of here's how college works. So that because of discrimination in the past, that people are behind, and that there's going to just have to be that active moving of uplifting people from a systemic point of view, so that if we just sort of think, oh, it will just eventually get better on its own, we're kind of ignoring that some people their starting line is further away from our starting line.
And that sets up very well.
Yeah,
well,
Kate?
I was going to say, I do kind of have a question about that, though, because I realize a little bit of what we're discussing, and probably where I started even, was not really discussing privilege, but discussing marginalization. And I'm thinking back to the Google images and this idea that if I did a search for what is privilege, I would think of that almost as like a reward. Like that's something you want. You want to give everyone the privilege to do something. You want to give people earn the privilege to do this or that, and it's a good thing, and it's something to aspire to even. So then I'm left wondering, so if the people who are going to be having the discussion about privilege are in fact those with privilege rather than the marginalized people, is that a fair discussion? Is it really useful? Should we be discussing marginalization instead?
I think my instinct is to say that there is a need to talk about marginalization. There's a need to talk about privilege. We'll return with what Bonnie was just saying. I think really will set up well when we return to definitions of equity versus equality. But one of the things I think is important in the work on privilege is that some of that work needs to be done if on a characteristic self-reflection shows that you're on the privilege side of that, then a lot of that work needs to be done internally and recognizing the privilege and not taking it for granted and assuming that you have that privilege because that not to confuse privilege with difference in your human capabilities, that you are a better person, to confuse that a privilege is a sign of worth in some way, shape, or form. So I think that is something that if we're talking about any of these characteristics, that if one is in the privileged group, then some of that is work that needs to be done internally or with other people that share the privilege to figure out, okay, what are we experiencing here, and how might this be inadvertently and unintentionally and systematically excluding others.
Well, and I think we're going to get to a different term here, and it might help us think through this. So hold those thoughts, everybody. So we're going to have another chance to send in your polling answers. Our next question is, have you heard of the term intersectionality and what it means? So A, not heard of it, B, heard of it, but not sure what it means, C, familiar, D, very familiar and use it in my planning work. So jump in here.
Okay, everyone, it's up on your screen, so go ahead and enter your selection. Give it 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it and show our results. Okay, have you heard of intersectionality and what it means? The highest percentage of 51%, nope, haven't heard of it. 30%, I have heard of it, but not sure what it means. 15% are familiar with it, and 4% are very familiar and use it in their planning work. And
Okay,
the screen
great.
is back to you.
Great, thank you. And I have found that thinking about intersectionality really helps me get at what Cade was just talking about. Again, here's our Google image search of what intersectionality means. And so think back to that social identities exercise. We need to be thinking in terms of how all those identities actually intersect, and how they all contribute to the lived experiences of each person. And some of the identities result in privilege and some result in marginalization, and it all depends on context. So this idea of intersectionality really was where I started to think about what this really means on the ground, and making this thinking about privilege something that is actionable. So it also brings us back to seeing the individual versus just overgeneralizing and group stereotypes. So it's defined as the interconnected nature of social categorization, such as race, class, and gender, as they appear to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage or advantage. And so it's easy to talk about privilege and to immediately start thinking of white privilege, but the intersectionality is reminding us that there's also gender conforming privilege, there's heterosexual privilege, there's male privilege, there's socioeconomic privilege, there's Christian privilege, age privilege, and also able-bodied privilege. And it's not until I started kind of seeing things from this intersectionality point of view that I could kind of figure out what this means, and that it's highly changeable depending on the person, and it's highly changeable depending on contexts. So I have a little scenario to maybe help us think about these things. And so here's the scenario. You are a planning director at a city. You are to mediate a dispute between your zoning administrator who has applied a regulation and the applicant who says they did so incorrectly, and they want to send a complaint to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So as you are sitting there and you are picturing the zoning administrator and you are picturing the applicant, who are you picturing? And I would kind of bet that you're picturing a white male zoning administrator and that you're picturing a white male applicant. If that's what you're picturing and you immediately go to, well, I'm going to ask them questions and see what happened here by just looking at the rules and regulations and just see, did they get applied properly? But now, if I change the picture and if we think about what if the zoning administrator is a white male and the applicant is a Black male? Does that maybe change how you would approach what happened in this situation? Then if we think about, well, what if the zoning administrator is a white woman making a zoning administrator's salary and the applicant is a wealthy Hispanic male? Does that influence how you think about what you would do in this situation to figure out what happened? And then if you think about what if the zoning administrator only has an undergraduate degree and the applicant has a master's degree in urban planning, does that influence how you think about things, whether you want it to or not? Whether you're wanting to just say, I'm going to base my decision by just looking at the rules and regulations myself, well, that kind of means that you're ignoring some other things that might be going on. So that sort of shedding light on the intersectionality and how the advantages and disadvantages of that situation changes depending on who these people are. That's what has been meaningful to me about understanding what intersectionality is.
Well, and I would add that there are the characteristics that can confer privilege, kind of our phenotype, what we exhibit to the world, and then they're the ones that we can't see. Mm-hmm. And that's where we have to be careful not to make too many assumptions, because those assumptions can lead us astray. It means slowing down and getting to know people better, and it also requires a tremendous amount of self-awareness, because you don't want to interrogate somebody about all their life and everything that led them up to needing this various.
Right, yeah.
But you also need to be open to the fact that just because two people look alike does not mean that they are bringing the same experience to the table.
So let's get on to some other terms here. But first we have some other exercises for enhancing self-awareness and some things that you might try or think about that might help you figure out what this is all about.
Well, and if it's not clear already, one thing I think is worth making overt again is that we are opening a number of doors today. These are lifelong processes. The terms intersectionality and privilege were not prominent except in certain parts of, say, the academic literature or subsets of the population. And these terms and many of these things are changing over time in the ways we think about identity. I know when I was in middle school that thinking about LGBTQIA would have not made sense to us at the time. There wasn't that language. And so this is an ongoing process. It's not a set of answers that we are giving you here. So in terms of enhancing self-awareness, at some point you may want to load up and watch a video of a privilege walk, and maybe I'll describe it and then ask Kate or Bonnie if they have thoughts on if they have any experience with this. But a privilege walk, essentially what you can do is line up a number of people in a line and have everybody face the same direction. And you go through something like the social identities worksheet, and you say, take a step forward if you're white and a step back if you are not white. And if you are male, and if you are not male, and do the steps forward and back. And so what happens is you get the spread of the room based on people's identities, and it exposes intersectionality as well. I'm curious, I know I have my own thoughts, but Bonnie or Kate, do you have thoughts on, have you participated in one? Do you have thoughts on how this actually works?
I have not participated in one, but I definitely want Bonnie to explain some of her experience and some of the pitfalls, because I think this is really important, because it really, I think, highlights how difficult it is to have this discussion, no matter how well intentioned.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so in the image on the screen, you're seeing where they tried to do a modified privilege walk, where you have people mark down their answers and whether they would take a step forward or a step back on a piece of paper that they then put on the wall anonymously. So each person goes into the room individually, puts up their sticky note, and then leaves. And that's one way of sort of showing these things, but you're not actually having to stand there as either the highly privileged person or stand there as the highly marginalized person. We did a modification of this privilege walk actually at the Kansas planning conference, where instead of you being yourself and doing the privilege walk, we handed you a piece of paper that had an identity on it. And we ended up with some people at the front of the room and some people were out the door. And I think it was very sobering to see that actually happening, but this sort of privilege walk needs to happen in a place where you're really trusting of people. And yeah, there can be some pitfalls to it. So that's one reason why we're putting up here, watch a video of it online and see what happens, and maybe don't actually do it unless you've got a group of people who trust each other and are real comfortable with each other.
I think that's sage advice. I've watched one that's been done with students, and it's been videotaped, and it's really bothering because you have some students that essentially have been pushed to the back who are crying. They're visibly shaken, and other kids giggling at the front.
Yeah.
And giddy in a sense, and it's revealing. It's very revealing about some of the challenges we face, but those are human beings that are having to do it.
Yeah.
I do know colleagues that do it and really they really have found it to be very beneficial. But those are people who, one, it depends on your identity, and have you had a group of people you're working with together for months at a time, and you have a good sense of trust and rapport and a sense of compassion for each other, and also the skill of the person who's then going to facilitate a discussion about it. Because doing the exercise alone and then just letting it sit is not what we want to be doing.
Yeah. The other thing you can do that's sort of just for self-awareness is take an implicit bias test. And we've put up a link there, one you can take. And it's basically showing you photos of different people and asking you just to click on one as good or bad. And for me, when I did this was a humbling experience, because I have to admit that my response rate of responding good to an African American image was slower than my response to an image of a white person. And I'm not proud of it, but it was very revealing to me and helped me realize that I still need to do some work. So is it maybe time to move on to some other things to think about?
Yeah, but I wanted to give people also one piece of context. The implicit bias tests go through things like race and sex. They also go through things like body size. There's a number of different ones that you can take. And one of the things that I would say that we have to simultaneously kind of hold in balance is we receive messages all the time through media, through moving through space. And there's a concept called neuroplasticity. Our brains are constantly rewiring. And every time we get a message, it causes a set of neurons to fire together. And that strengthens that set of neurons. So if you turn on a news channel and see something that has a high level of privilege and marginalization in a TV show or whatever it might be, that's reinforcing in your brain the next time having what might be a racist thought or a body image favoring people who are skinnier in these messages. And we know we see this, otherwise there wouldn't be marketing and advertising if we couldn't shape how people think. So that creates a tension between the fact that we are all being, it's like we're walking through a forest and there's all sorts of thorns that we're encountering all the time coming into our bodies, and we can choose to ignore them, or we can choose to take them out. It does not make you a bad person necessarily to have implicit bias. It's information that then you can work with and try to proactively change yourself moving forward.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that you're kind of pointing out to us, Ward, is that we sort of, whether we like it or not, automatically divide people into us and them.
And that evolved for us strategically. There's evidence out there that humans, many ways that our brains work, were evolved to be in small groups of somewhere between 25 and 150, and that helped us survive. There's wisdom in having a sense of us. It gives us protection. It gives us a sense that we're going to be able to rear our young and protect each other. What becomes challenging is when the difference between us and them becomes arbitrary, and also when there's conflict between an us and a them. And part of it has happened is that we no longer move through a forest or a savanna or other landscapes as herders, as herders and work in small groups. And so we are now in a global society and we are bumping into thems all the time. So we have some reflection questions that we'd ask you to think about. Have you seen us and them dynamics in our work and your work? And what does that look like? What impact does that have? And what's a planner's role in addressing us versus them? That's a lot to digest.
Well, and I would just say that you know, what, as a planner, what comes up all the time in us versus them is often renters versus homeowners. That seems to be just so common. And then we as planners have to figure out how can we get affordable housing when we're trying to deal with this us versus them all the time. And then I think we're going to move on to some other kind of definitions and things.
Yeah, and the us versus them, though, doesn't have to be super fraud. It can be elected officials versus the planning unit. Some planning units have a bunker.
No, that never happens.
You could have a bunker mentality, or you could have a planning department that has a struggle with the public works. I mean, these things happen. They don't have to be very difficult on identity issues, but they do pop up all the time. What do we mean when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and privilege? Well, we've talked about a number of these things. One thing, when we do our Google image search on diversity, we see when ask people to, in an interactive setting, the color is the first thing that jumps out. The variation in skin color, the variation in the images that are here. One of the things that I've only begun to really notice consistently recently is how often people say that someone is diverse. But someone can't be diverse. I mean, you can have multiple identities, multiple different characteristics, but you cannot simultaneously be diverse in one identity. That's what identity means. And so then what we need to think about is, as a group, we have diversity. And diversity can be across many different dimensions. And I think sometimes we fall into the trap of associating diversity with skin color, and that we think that that hiring for diversity should be thought of as exclusively hiring somebody with a different skin color. And that's a limited way to approach diversity. And it also can tokenize the individual that is brought in for diversity. So intellectual, practical, personal engagement with issues related to social justice and equity. This is something that Bonnie touched on earlier, the difference between equality and equity. I call your attention to the upper left corner. This image, sometimes in life, we like it when there's equality because we happen to be the tall person. And sometimes in life, again, this is where we're intersectional and multiple identities, we would much prefer equity because we're the short person in the image. It raises some interesting tensions. You can see this in our society between sort of individualism, equality, we're all going to be at the same starting line, versus as a community, do we want everybody to be able to see? And so this distinction between equality and equity is one that we see, I think, also play out in a lot of us versus them discussions. If we're not cognizant of our privilege, it's easy to think that equality is fair. But when we begin to recognize our privileges, we might begin to think, oh, wait a second. I'm aware of ways that my box is taller than someone else's, or we're standing equal, but I was brought to the starting line in a better position than other people who are here with me. So equity we can think of as a safe, healthy, and fair environment for all people. And I think we would argue, and hopefully it would land in fertile ground on your end, the seed of thinking that equity can cross any dimension of our work in planning. Schools, housing, workplaces, public spaces, transportation. When I hear inclusion and look at an image like this, I see again the color that's very similar to diversity, but we begin to see a little bit more of bringing in people with different physical abilities. You see some wheelchairs here. When I hear inclusion, I'm reminded of Richard Florida's creative class book from 2003 or so, where the alliteration was cities need technology, talent, and tolerance. And while that worked out pretty well for having the 3 T's in his book, there are very few people who, when they walk into a space, say, you know what I really want today is to be tolerated. Inclusion is a much more holistic point, and I think that as planners, we have learned a lot going back over the last few decades that we need to engage the public, not just when we come to some decision menu, but in framing the problem. and to having a vision for our community. And that's inclusion at every step of the way. And inclusion challenges us to think again about privileges. If we hold a public meeting at 3 in the afternoon, there are people who can make it and people who can't. If we hold a meeting without childcare, who is excluded from being able to attend, even though we didn't set out to exclude them? So fully involving and engaging all people in the community. So it's equity in process and diversity in process.
So we'll ask you to think about today, have you seen these sorts of struggles, diversity, equity, inclusion in your work, and what your role is? And we're just about to give you some ways of thinking about your role.
This is a book that I have. It's Deep Diversity, a book by Shaquille Chowdhury, a Canadian education and diversity consultant and thinker. And he provides us with a very useful framework that's grounded in the latest sort of psychology and neuroscience, as well as thinking about systematic ways that we interact as people. And I think as planners, most of us at some point have been taught or experienced or identified with the desire to speak truth to power or to work the levers of power. We're cognizant of elected officials' power and administrators' power and citizen power. We also, I think, see tribalism a lot, this us versus them, whether it's within our units, within city government, whether it's opposing neighborhoods, developers versus a neighborhood. These power and tribes we're pretty familiar with seeing in our work. We also need to be aware of biases. I think we all probably know intuitively that we do not think perfectly logically all the time. There's been Nobel Prize winning work over and over again over the last few decades showing ways that we fall into traps, because if we were to slow down and try to take in every piece of information in our environment, we would spend our whole life just trying to see what's around us at this moment. So we have all sorts of shortcuts in our brains, but they can lead us into traps. And one of our jobs, and one of the things I think our field can bring, is we try to slow down and be deliberative and do analysis and get the relevant data. Where I would argue as a field we often fall short is we forget that every single thought we have is somehow affected by our emotions. Whether we're talking about feelings of privilege and marginalization in a heated public meeting, or if we're just talking about the fact that perhaps someone honked their horn mercilessly as you drove into work today. Those kinds of things affect how we feel and how the people around us feel, and they affect how we think. And then those things can serve to reinforce and complicate us versus them in power dynamics. This is a book, it's a very short, very readable volume. I highly recommend for any planner that wants to think about these issues of privilege. The book also has 8 very short inner skills that one can work on, some exercises on your own time. I think the upshot of the book that is really a novel way to think is that a lot of us are familiar with across different religion and philosophical traditions that do unto others as you'd have them do to you. That's good, but Chowdhury argues for the platinum rule, which is way harder to do. Treat others the way they want to be treated. We can't assume that other people want to be treated the way we are treated or the way that we want to be treated. And again, and consistent with some of the themes, this is not a sprint, but it's an ultra marathon. It is going to span generations, but we can't leave it up to the generations after us to do this kind of work.
Well, and Ward does an interesting exercise in his class with planning students where he takes the AICP Code of Ethics and he asks students to look for whether they see any of the 4 pillars in the code: emotions, biases, tribes, and power. And maybe Ward, just tell us briefly what that exercise seems to reveal.
Well, it is interesting. There's plenty of attention to us versus them. It even sometimes inadvertently puts us, the planners, versus the public, as if we're not part of our communities. But there's an importance to our professional identity, so that's attention. There is certainly attention to power and thinking about people who are most vulnerable in our communities. There's a little bit about biases, sort of if you think about integrity of the information and analysis that we do, that we're trying to be deliberative and not just kind of shoot from the hip, so to speak, and go with our quick thinking. What my students and I've seen consistently is there's almost nothing in there about what we might think of as emotional or social intelligence, that we need to be aware of ourselves and how we feel at any given moment, and how the people we're interacting with feel like that has any shaping of our work.
Yeah, that seems to really be missing, and we're going to have another chance for you to wake up and use your keyboard here. What do you think about emotions in your work? You can choose A, yeah, emotion happens and I yell. B, yeah, emotion happens and I want to run away or I freeze up. C, I just suck it up and get through it. I remain neutral. Or D, I'm very aware of self-care and pay attention to when emotions are taking a negative toll on me. So what do you think about that? Maybe I've lost Christine even.
Oh no, I'm here. I'm trying to pull it up for you.
Okay.
Well, and while it's being pulled up, there's an interesting blog post recently by Lisa Schweitzer in California, who raises the question, when do we talk about the emotional abuse of planners? And has some provocative thoughts that you may find interesting for thinking about your own work.
It is loaded. It's up on the screen. Everyone can go ahead and plug in. We'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it and show our results. Okay, what do you think about emotions in our work? 6%, which is the lowest. Yeah, emotions happen and I yell. 10%, yeah, emotions happen and I want to run away or I freeze up. The largest percentage, 44%, I just suck it up and get through it. I remain neutral. And then 40%, I pay attention to when emotions take a negative toll on me. So those are our results. And I'm gonna throw your slide right back on. There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I find it fascinating that from that, 1 in 6 planners is essentially experiencing kind of trauma type experiences with emotions. They're feeling like the need to yell back or to shut down, and that's not sustainable. That will lead to burnout, among other problems.
Well, and it is enlightening to see that 40% of you are paying attention, which is great. And we're wondering, how have you learned to manage your emotions at work? A, I haven't. B, on the job through trial and error. C, formally through job training or self-help resources. Or D, I learned it in school.
And that one is also now up.
Okay, great. We're gonna, after this, wrap things up and open it up for questions.
I'm really fascinated to see what some of the responses are here.
Yeah.
We'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close it down and show our results here. Okay. How have you learned to manage your emotions at work? 5%, I haven't. 70% on the job, trial and error. 19% formally through job training or self-help resources, and 6% in undergrad or graduate school. So I'm going to close that, and the screen is back.
Well, gosh, those are some sobering numbers for Ward and I, who are professors who are teaching planning students. Shows like we maybe need to do some work on providing some help for those future planners.
Well, and it also, I was just going to add that it also, I recently looked at more than 400 different AICP events in July and August, and of those, about 10% had something to do with facilitation or public engagement. Only one of them really had anything to do with emotions in work, and it was about essentially how to deal with an oppositional public meeting. So we're not helping each other very much.
We know we're thrown into it a lot, and then we're not given some good tools to deal with them. So just some closing thoughts on what can you do. Do some homework, some self-reflection, that social identities worksheet, the implicit bias tests. Read some feminist or queer theory. Don't go it alone. Look for allies, opportunities, experts, elected officials looking to address diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Hey, those social welfare people know a lot. Use your critical eye, critically evaluate plans and processes. How did we get here? Are they based on some sort of cultural hierarchies or systemic ways of thinking that are impacting what we're doing today? Think about those 4 pillars and whether and how those are influencing your thinking. Seek out and push for training. Look for cultural competency training. Interact, purposely seek out people different from yourself, and take care of yourself. This is intellectual and emotional labor. So remember self-care, and doggone it, it's a marathon. Sometimes the best you can do is be fearless and keep trying, and give yourself a break when you make mistakes. So we are now at the point where we have some questions.
Okay, well, we don't have a ton of time. We might only get to 1 or 2 of these.
Yeah.
But that's okay. So let's see. What should we do here? There's so many. I want to see which one I want to go with here. Alrighty. So Wade, you were discussing, this is way back in the beginning, Black versus white in daily life, living in New York City. I found it very enlightening and thought-provoking that Black seeks identity as African-American privilege and Black Hispanic looked upon as less privileged. There's a perceived hierarchy generally among the ethnicities in this racially diverse community, which was surprising to me. So I didn't know if anyone wanted to comment on that. It's just a comment. It wasn't a question, but I wanted that one to get out there. If you have any comments on it, or if not, we can move on into a question.
Yeah, that's really showing that intersectionality and how in some contexts, something might be marginalization, and others it might be privilege.
And this was brought up about all the different types of privilege. And this question is, I recently heard the term skinny privilege with respect to the privilege society provides to thin people versus heavy or obese. Is this yet another example of discrimination we should seriously consider, given the differing values society places on people of different shapes and sizes?
Yeah, exactly. And part of that implicit bias test will test those things as well. And see, when privilege was first brought up in big thinking circles, it was thought of as simply white male privilege, and that's what it was. It wasn't till later that people started going, wait, there are other privileges out there, and people started bringing up intersectionality, and so skinny privilege, that's another one to add to that list to raise our awareness.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Well, this is I've had a lot of comments. Yes, this webcast, it is recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast, and we will have a recording, or I'm sorry, we will have a PDF copy of the presentation on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. One of these questions I want to follow up on. You had mentioned a link, Bonnie. I'm trying to find it now because a couple people asked about it. We've got a lot of questions, so I've been trying to sift through them. Oh, there we go. Could you please provide us links to that identity survey that you mentioned before, and also who the author is of Deconstructing Privilege?
Yeah, so Deconstructing Privilege is Kim Case, C-A-S-E. And then on finding a social identities worksheet, if you just do an online search for social identities worksheet, a bunch will come up.
And I like the British Columbia one because it does do that context part.
Mm-hmm.
But the links to all the resources, there should be enough information for any of the resources we mentioned in the slides. And if not, feel free to email certainly Bonnie or I, and we will be responsive.
Yeah. And I will put a plug in for that. The AICP Ethics Committee is getting ready to launch an update of the code. So if this has prompted any thoughts on your behalf that you would like to express, or anything you would like to suggest about changing the code, please do send those to me. I'm on the committee, and we really are looking for your input.
Great. I think we have, let's see, we have time for one more question. Let's see. Do you have any facilitation tools that you have found most effective for talking about discrimination with the community?
One thing that I've read about that worked really good in actual planning practice was something called a house autobiography, and that's where in a small group setting you have people write down and talk about the different houses they've lived in over the years, and then they discuss them. And that reveals how each one is thinking differently about what a neighborhood means or what being a neighbor means. And so that's one way of revealing perhaps that people are coming from different points of view. So that's one that I can think of right off the top of my head.
Well, and one thing, I'd be curious what was in the questioner's head, but I think one point really to emphasize is that this is about community building and climate, and it's there are techniques that can be helpful for facilitation. A lot of things that people learn in facilitation training is consistent with what we're talking about, but sometimes that facilitation training stops short of thinking through as overtly about our own identities and privileges and how that shapes facilitation. But I think the biggest point is that it takes, again, self-awareness and self-regulation is what planners can work on. And then the tools that we have in our toolbox already can really be used more effectively in terms of facilitation.
Great. Okay.
And community
a couple people actually. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, building community takes time. This cannot be done in a drive-by format.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and close up shop. And a couple people asked how many folks we have on the line, just based on some of the polls that we took. And there are over 400 people on the line. So we had a really great group today. And thanks to all three of you for putting this together and kind of being out on the front line there and talking about these issues. We really appreciate it. Again, head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast and you can get a downloaded PDF version of the presentation, and we'll have a recording up shortly on our YouTube channel. And everyone, we will talk next time. Thanks again and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.